Today's podcast is on nature, nurture, and the endocrine system. Nature versus nurture is a really big question in psychology, and it's a big debate. But in order to understand it, there's some terms we need to know first. The first term is behavior genetics. This is the study of our differences and the relative effects of heredity and the environment. DNA, the blueprint of genetic information for our cells. There are segments within DNA, and these are called genes. And these genes make proteins that determine our development. The genome. This is the common sequence within the entire human DNA. This shared genetic profile makes us humans rather than another species. The Human Genome Project was completed in 2003. It took 13 years. The project identified all of the human genes and made them accessible for future studies. Molecular genetics. This studies the molecular structure and function of genes. It helps us to find genes that work together, that determine traits, or reveal at-risk populations for diseases. Some other things we'll look at are separated twins. So a number of studies compared identical twins reared separately from birth or close after birth and found several similarities between the two. Although this isn't common to have identical twins separated at birth, it does make an ideal study situation for whether behavior is determined by your genetics, so your nature, or by how you were raised, your nurture. Adoption studies suggest that adoptees, who may be biologically unrelated, tend to be different from their adoptive parents and siblings. We'll also look at the gene-environment interaction. Genes can influence traits, which affect responses, and the environment can affect gene activity. So, for example, a genetic predisposition that makes a child restless and hyperactive evokes an angry response from parents. A stressful environment can then trigger genes to manufacture neurotransmitters that lead to depression. Heritability. This is the extent to which variation among individuals can be attributed to their differing genes. This study focuses on the differences between multiple organisms for a single trait. It's a description of a certain population, not an individual. Epigenetics. Epigenetics studies the molecular mechanisms by which environmental triggers can switch genes on or off. And then natural selection and adaptation. Animal breeding experiments demonstrate the power of genetic selection. In humans, genes endow us with the capacity to adapt. Genes and experience work together to wire the human brain. Evolutionary psychology studies why humans are alike. Specifically, it studies the evolution of behavior and mind using principles of natural selection. Traits that contribute to the reproduction and survival are more likely to be passed on in a species. We'll also look at gender differences in sexuality. Males and females, to a large extent, behave and think similarly. The main differences in sexes actually arises just in regards to reproductive behaviors. And according to natural selection has caused males to send their genes into the future by mating with multiple females, since males have lower costs involved. They don't need to carry the child and grow them after fertilization. So there's lower cost involved for them as an organism. Females, on the other hand, select one mature and caring mate because of the higher costs involved with pregnancy and nursing. So there are some key criticisms of the evolutionary perspective. Evolutionary psychologists take a behavior and work backwards to explain it in terms of natural selection. That's a criticism. The evolutionary psychologists would say back that they need to test behaviors that expound on evolutionary principles. Another criticism, evolutionary psychology proposes genetic determinism and undercuts morality in establishing society. So what that means is genetic determinism says we are the way we are because of our genes. There's nothing we can do about it. Evolutionary psychologists would say, we have adapted, but we do not dictate how we ought to be. And then a final criticism, where genders are unequal, gender preferences are wide, but when they are closely equal, preferences narrow down. Evolutionary psychologists would say that males and females are more alike than they are different. And if we study these differences, we can establish their causes. So, the way psychology approaches the nature versus nurture debate today is through the biopsychosocial approach. So, we look at the biological influences, the psychological influences, and the sociocultural influences. The biological influences says that we have a shared human genome. There's individual genetic variations. We also look at the prenatal environment, genes, hormones, and physiology when we're looking at why someone behaves the way that they do. For psychological influences, we look at the gene-environment interaction. We look at neurological effect of early experiences, responses evoked by our own personality, gender, etc., beliefs, feelings, and expectations. And then we have our socio-cultural influences. So how do our parents and peers influence us? How are cultural attitudes and norms towards us? What are cultural gender norms? How does that affect our behavior? The next topic in our notes is the endocrine system. So your brain triggers your master gland, or the pituitary gland. This gland triggers other glands, and these glands produce hormones. And hormones affect your brain and your body, and this process starts all over again. So the anterior pituitary gland, it secretes the growth hormones. So if there's too much growth hormone, we have something called gigantism. Too little growth hormone, we have something called dwarfism. So you'll see a picture in the top right of your screen that shows what the anterior pituitary gland looks like. And then there's an example in the bottom right of your screen of someone that has gigantism and someone with dwarfism. The posterior pituitary gland, you'll see the same picture in the top right. Notice the posterior is that purple color. This secretes two hormones, vasopressin and oxytocin. Vasopressin constricts blood vessels and raises blood pressure, while oxytocin is the love hormone, and it would trigger labor in females. The thyroid gland is actually found kind of in your neck, and you'll see a picture in the top right of what that looks like. This secretes two main hormones, thyroxine and triiothyronine. This increases your metabolic rate, growth, and maturation. If you have a thyroid that's hyperactive, it means the thyroid's producing too much thyroxine, and this can accelerate metabolism and cause unintentional weight loss and a rapid or irregular heartbeat, and it can be called Graves' disease. A hypoactive thyroid is when the thyroid produces too little thyroxine. It can cause fatigue, sensitivity to cold, constipation, dry skin, or unexplained weight gain. And this could also be called Hashimoto's disease. Parathyroids are located right on the thyroid gland, and so these secrete parathyroid hormones. They increase your blood calcium and decrease your potassium. The pancreas, you'll notice, is in your abdomen. This secretes insulin, and this regulates your blood sugar levels. Diabetes occurs when blood sugar or glucose builds up in the bloodstream, and this is because the pancreas is not producing enough insulin. Ovaries are found in females, and they secrete estrogen. They promote ovulation and female sex characteristics. Testes are found in males. These secrete androgens. Testosterone is a type of androgen, and these promote sperm production and male sex characteristics. The adrenal glands sit in your lower back right on top of your kidneys like little hats, and they secrete two hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. These arouse your body in times of stress. So we will talk about something called the fight or flight response when it comes to your adrenal glands.